Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I have the honor to be the first speaker and open by showing you 20 or some slides. If I skip something, I can leave it for a later discussion because we'll discuss the causes, consequences, and the outlook of the region after the financial crisis. I put together statistics, being a macroeconomist by my background. The topics I'd like to cover are the following. A little bit about Europe, how I see it and how Europe is seen through statistics. A second, of course, Central Eastern Europe. We may use the term Central Europe, also Central Eastern Europe. The focus of my presentation is, of course, naturally is Hungary and the Visegrad countries, although I'd like to quote some statistics concerning countries of the larger region. And then a little bit about the outlook trends, and then we'll start the conversations and discussions, which would end about 6 o'clock in the afternoon. Now, GDP. Well, the economists always talk about GDP, being criticized for talking about GDP. What you can see is that if you look at the countries that we regard the neighbors or countries of the same level of development, we had a beautiful, most of us a beautiful decade until the October 2008 with the collapse of the Lehman Brothers in a weekend in September. Life has changed drastically in Budapest and in the region. Capital flow stopped, a sort of sudden stop took place, and then triggered off a very deep contraction, which was, of course, a worldwide phenomenon. Before that, some countries had phenomenal growth, say Slovakia, but also the Hungarian growth looked pretty fine. But as you can see, the Hungarian story is a little bit different because Hungary experienced some slowdown and even a minor recession way before the disturbances in the capital markets hit the region. And then the decline, with the notable exception of Poland, and then recovery, and in case of Hungary and the Czech Republic, also secondary shocks. So the first lesson is that economy was in pretty good shape in this part of the world, and if you just compare the magnitude of changes, it's very telling, because compared to rich countries, the Eurozone countries, or the USA or Japan, the growth before the shock was less dynamic. Well, being rich countries, that's not so surprising. The decline was not as deep as in case of Hungary. The contraction in, say, Germany was 4%, in the USA 2-3%, in case of Hungary close to 7% in the year 2009. And that's something we have to keep in mind. So comparing the eastern periphery of the European Union, so to say, the CE countries and the rich countries, before the changes, before the financial shocks, the growth was faster, but also the contraction was deeper. So one conclusion is immediately that we are much more sensitive to the changes in the world economy. Now, catch up. Wherever I went, when I was inactive in politics for a short while, every second question was, thank you, Mr. Minister, for talking about the present story, but when will we reach the level of Europe? So that's the obvious question. Yeah? And then you say something, and now we have statistics about the catch-up. If we take the core Europe as 100, taking the GDP per capita, now economists in the classroom, in the room, you know perfectly, it's not a classroom but a room, that GDP is a particular indicator of economic activity. It's not a perfect indicator. But if you take Europe, the rich Europe or Europe, core Europe as 100, you can see that after the first shock of transition, which was very deep, very harsh, very tough in the early 1990s, the region per capita income of the region stood 35 to 65, and at the time of the financial crisis, we managed to catch up in some sense since 55 to say, close to 80 or something like that. So it's, historically speaking, that was a pretty successful period of convergence. You can also notice that convergence is never linear. Say the Czech Republic had a period of relative decline and also relative convergence. The Slovak story is also a couple of years with no convergence, and then after a spectacular growth. The Polish story is also some years of relative, it's not real stagnation, but compared to the European average. And this is for the politicians and also for the men of the street is something very important, very logical question, and also deep-rooted in our history, catching up with the rich neighbors, catching up with nations with whom we live together in, say, the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. So this is the story, and it looks nice. It looks promising. You can also notice the Hungarian specialty. The Hungarian catch-up was quite significant, but after a while, and this happened in the early 2000s, there has not been much convergence. So the Hungarian story is not a crisis. Is not a doesn't look problematic, but in some sense it's problematic because there has been no catch-up, and therefore GDP-wise we are at about, say, 50% compared to European average, and therefore to reach the European 100, it would take centuries if we just put it into a mathematical model. We'll see. Now, of course, the Central European or Central Eastern European nations' progress should be compared to other periphery countries, since the challenges of catching up is not a uniquely East European, Central Eastern European story. So I checked the figures of other periphery nations, and then we have a different scale. If 100 is the average of the EU 15, some countries, actually the Ireland is the only country that managed to surpass 100, and others have a mixed record. We talked last night about the Portuguese story. Portugal has been catching up, but this convergence is very not the dynamic, not much relation with EU Euro non-Eurozone, because in the Eurozone, before the Eurozone, and that's a footnote to what I'm going to talk about. Currency issues are important, but the growth and lack of growth is an extremely complicated phenomenon, a social process, and therefore it's very hard to find a direct link between the currency arrangement, the currency zone, and the performance of a country. Now, the Irish story is certainly interesting. I happened to be in London working for EBRD when the Irish dynamism hit the newspapers, and I remember that when the statistics was out, I knocked at the door of my colleague, the British colleague, and said, "John, I've got good news for you. The Irish GDP per capita has surpassed yours." And he said, "No, it's impossible." So, but being a gentleman, English gentleman, the following day he came back to me, "You're right, I've checked the figures. The figures are right, but don't forget this GDP, not national income, not GNI, not GMP, GDP." Yeah, but it's true. So if GDP is the measure of value added generated on the soil of the country, a given country, not the national income of those who live there. So therefore, it's a little bit over-reports the progress of the country. But anyway, there has been some catch-up until the crisis hit the southern periphery. There was a catch-up, as we see in Central Eastern Europe, and then came the financial crisis, which led to synchronized contraction all over the world. Now, still, the crisis is just one footnote in history, and there are long trends. I quote here a research paper prepared by Zsolt Daros, a Hungarian economist working for the Bruegel Institute in Brussels, and his forecast is, that's very interesting, and also the long series is that there has been a catch-up within Europe. Now, the benchmark is the US per capita income for Europe, and as you can see, when we talk about Europe, actually we have 5 Europes, and that makes any statement about the European economy a bit complicated. Which Europe you are talking about? You are talking about the north with Scandinavia and Great Britain, talking about the west, France and Germany, or talking about south, and the South European catch-up has been tremendously successful for a while, and then now we have a problem period, as we heard last night in the Portugal context, but also the Spanish. And if you look at the GDP figures of Italy, this all is, it's all in negative range now, and the Greek problem is perfectly known to you. Now, compared to the, so to say, unavoidable relative decline of South Europe, compared to the Central Europe is on the convergence path, and these are the months or years when the GDP-wise Central Eastern European nations and Central Europe, as a sort of component of the European Union, will take over South Europe in terms of GDP per capita. And East, Bulgaria, Romania, Serbia, and others have also a prospect of convergence, but as you can see, the starting position is very low, and that also indicates the problem of European decision makers, because this is a continent consisting of 5 subsets, and it's not easy to harmonize policies. It's extremely hard, and for analysts, it's extremely hard to make any statement about the European economy, because you have to make sure that you know which Europe you are talking about. Now, Europe is extremely diverse, and we love diversity in life, in nature, but in terms of finance, it's a very embarrassing chart. This is the GDP-wise, the government debt, the public sector debt, and as we all know, under the Stability and Growth Pact, you should be below 60% of the GDP in normal times, and if you want to join the Euro club, this famous Maastricht criteria was also 60%. And if you look at this threshold, the average of the Eurozone members and the European members and the majority of existing the members have higher debt than this threshold figure. So this also indicates that European Union has rules, and the rules are not kept. So rules are not serious, the rules are not having strong enough influence on reality. Now, of course, being a Hungarian, I cannot avoid the story of Hungary. The Hungarian GDP, government debt as percentage of GDP is about 80, or 79, 80, depending on the exchange rate, because half of it is in foreign currency, so therefore the exact size is a function of the exchange rate of the day. But this 80 is too much. You can say it's in the league of UK and Germany, but we are not British, we are not German, and so this debt is too much for us. And other countries of the region, Croatia, Poland, Slovakia, and others, Bulgaria and Romania, having surprisingly limited government debt. That's ironic that the new members, the poor members, so to say, have kept their the budget much more under control than richer nations. I'm not talking about Hellas, and because that's a special case, but certainly the average is an embarrassingly high. Second, the range within the club is too wide. You cannot imagine such a variety within the United States among the states. So this is again something which is part of the explanation why Europe has such a complicated financial situation. About the region and about a little bit of the Hungarian story, we have visitors who've been here, who know the country, and you know that we have a problem with the debt, we have a problem with the growth, and just a couple of sentences about the history. Before the crisis, the countries which belong to a club, so to say, have had budget deficit much more than the 3% of the Maastricht Treaty. The then Orban cabinet inherited a high budget deficit, massaged it down to 3, and then the deficit went up again to a surprisingly, shockingly high figure, and then the incoming government failed to bring down the deficit. Instead, it kept extremely high, 7 to 9, even more % of GDP. In peacetime, it's absurdly high. And then finally, the European Union exercised pressure on the then Hungarian government, bring down the deficit. And this is the situation before the crisis, but these extremely high deficit years in Hungary have had grave consequences on the budget, on the growth potential, and also exposure when the crisis hit Europe. Because Hungary was one of the most indebted countries, certainly the most indebted of Central Eastern Europe, and not in a position to spend more, following the advice of John Maynard Keynes, that in the crisis when nobody spends, the government should spend. That's normal, that's logical, that all politicians would immediately understand. And as you can see, the Czech and the Polish government could spend more and saving the economies from the contraction of the aggregate demand. While in the Hungarian governments, the outgoing socialist government and the incoming new government had to keep budget down below the 3% threshold under the Maastricht Treaty and the Stability and Growth Pact. So budget deficit is something. Visitors will immediately notice that there are peaks every 5 years in this budget deficit, and the reason is pretty simple. I ask the audience, when do you think we have general election? Every 4 years. And then high. Now this is a bit unique because 2010, since Hungary had a program with the IMF and the EU, there was no room for the spending the classical way, buying the electorate. But unfortunately, the 3 elections before have been fought on welfare spendings, promises, and sometimes even delivered. Now, the consequences and sort of heat map of Europe. In the most recent issue of the Financial Times, there was a heat map of Great Britain, but in that chart, the blue is the good and the red is the bad. Now in this chart, the red is the high income purchasing power countries, purchasing power regions, and then you have the colder part of Europe where the purchasing income is a fraction of the rich nations, and then the region I'm talking about is just next to rich countries, making life harder for politicians because they're always under pressure by the general public of, at least promising catch up in terms of wealth and income. As you can see, we are neighbors to very rich countries. Southern Germany, North Italy, and the Benelux are the rich nations. And there's also some sort of cascade, because east of us, countries which are less developed. Yesterday I was in Serbia, the Hungarian-speaking part of Serbia, and then also, you can sense that the cascade of level of development. It's also complicates the life of the European decision makers because the regional differences within this union of 28 nations are huge, and sometimes within the same country, but across nations. Now, I couldn't stop looking at the Hungarian data and found it very interesting and a bit sad, because if you look at the Hungarian purchasing power, then we have the relatively rich part of Europe on the Vienna-Budapest axis. And actually, if you look at FDI, the foreign direct investors, they are in Europe, the Audi, the Mercedes-Benz, Ford, Suzuki, practically most of the foreign investment went where money was. And therefore, and there's not much FDI, foreign direct investment, in this part of Europe. Certainly the inflow of investors and investment funds are not helping us reduce the inequalities. Actually, they just add to inequality. So that's a challenge, and that also indicates that something has to be done, and more energy and money should be spent on regional policies. You may think this country is small enough, but no. Look at the map and you see we have at least 2 Hungaries. Some specific features that you have to understand when we discuss the consequences of the financial crisis and the present problems, and this is the ownership of the banks. Central Eastern Europe is unique. It's extremely different from, say, Latin America, Asia, Africa, because in the ex-communist countries, the former planned economies, majority of the banks are in the owners of foreigners, foreign investors. In some countries like Estonia, the share of foreigners are absurdly high, and if you compare it to, say, Spain, more or less the same living standard as say, the Czech Republic or Slovenia or Italy or Hellas before the most recent events, with the exception of the Irish. So typically, banks are in foreign ownership. The Hungarian figure is also pretty high, and then, of course, leads to sort of policy challenges. The Hungarian Prime Minister famously promised to bring down the foreign ownership below 50%. That's not a tall order, so Hungary is not extremely, not an extreme case compared to, say, Romania, Czech Republic, or Slovakia, but still, the fact is that banks, which are not much loved in this part of the world, the banks are not only not much loved, but banks are also foreign-owned. And this is a unique situation when we want to understand the relationship between the policy community and the banking community. It's not an easy relationship, but particularly complicated if politicians are local, domestic, and banks are foreign. We may come back to this topic. Now, it sounds a bit technical, but very useful to understand the problem of the Hungarian, the Romanian, partly the Polish economy, the role of the foreign exchange in our economy. So this is, as you can see, the companies, the non-financial companies, I'm not talking about banks, I'm talking about businesses, industrial, commercial businesses, how they finance their activity. And you can see that a very important part of their finance links them to the mother corporation. So, say Audi Hungary has a credit line with Audi Germany. It's obviously cheaper, and there's tax reasons and also financial reasons. So this is, of course, in case of Hungary, it's mostly euro. And they can also lend directly from foreign banks, mostly euro. And they can borrow from banks in Hungary, OTP or Erste, Raiffeisen, typically in euro. And this is what they borrow in forint. So the fact is that a typical Hungarian corporation would have the finances, it's 80% in non-Hungarian currency, typically in euro. So whatever the politicians feel about the euro, whether they like it or not, they want to enter the eurozone or not, the present Hungarian government is very skeptical on the euro. Actually, the firms have already decided. They are in the eurozone, whatever politicians feel about the subject. So it's a euroized, so to say, it's not a dollarized part of the world. Latin America, the dollar is the secondary currency or sometimes the main currency. It's a euroized economy. Now, in some sense, it's logical. What is a bit more complicated is the households, the Hungarian households, and this is true for some other countries, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Bulgaria, and Romania, partly Poland, but not for the Czech Republic. The households borrow in hard currency or non-local currency, and this is something which creates a lot of problem because the households earning their income in domestic currency, forint, have an exposure in hard currency. I'm using hard currency, but that's, just for short, it's typically euro, Swiss franc, sometimes even yen. Now, it's a yen is a shocking story. The Swiss franc is a complicated story, but it has a history. As you can see, the households started to borrow heavily in non-forint. Banks were happy to offer loans for housing, cars. And then now we have a long dispute of who's responsible for what, who made a mistake, who are the culprits for the process. And it's not easy to determine the components of this policy mess. Certainly, the government has taken measures to reduce the households' exposure in hard currency or typically in the Swiss franc, but this is certainly a disputed story in Hungary, and then it's part of the reason why two Hungarians meet in the tram 47, and not surprisingly, they talk about exchange rate. I hardly believe that two Americans meeting somewhere in the country club, they talk about the exchange rate of dollar-yen, unless you are in the foreign trade business. But here, it's everyday discussion because the exchange rate has a daily impact on the family, the budget. Complicated story, I just had to discuss it because otherwise you don't understand why the society is so sensitive, and also the politics is so sensitive to the currency issues. Now, banks in Hungary, I didn't say Hungarian banks because as you can see, 2/3 of the banks are non-Hungarian, 1/3, 40% of the banking assets are owned by Hungarian banks. The profitability of the banks before the crisis was obscenely high. I'm sitting on the board of supervisor report of one bank, so I know the banking industry from inside, and I know the reason why the profitability was so high, but the return on asset in Germany in a good year is about 5 to 6%, a very good year 10%, a bad year it's -1. But in this part of the world, and this is not uniquely Hungarian, you have the same statistics for the Czech Republic, you have a huge banking profitability even in crisis years. So not surprisingly, the incoming government 2010, looking back, recognized that the banks are full of cash, the banks are extremely profitable, the banks profited from the growth of lending to households, lending to businesses, sometimes in not foreign, relying on their cheap access before the crisis, loans through their international links, and then introduced bank taxes. So suddenly, after the special bank taxes, levies on tax, and also other measures, the profitability of the Hungarian banks collapsed, and 2011 and 2012 were years of huge losses. Now, the loss is, you can say, well, they had 10 good years, so they can survive 2, 3 bad years, which is true. But of course, loss-making banks, particularly owned by foreign owners, have to think twice to enlarge their activity. If they just try to consolidate their position, then they would not be in a situation and not in a mood to offer new loans. And certainly this is what happened in Hungary. We have a deleveraging, which is normal, which is logical, but too fast. And this deleveraging is part of the reason why Hungary has had a very low growth in recent years. So this is the Hungarian deleveraging story. All over the region after October 2008, when the crisis hit us, there was shrinking loan activity, a deleveraging it. But in case of more dynamic Poland or Slovakia, there's a recovery of banking activity. The Hungarian banking activity has been like quite linear and comparable only to that of Estonia, but that's for a different reason. In the Baltic republics, you had a huge bubble before the crisis. The Hungarian story is a bit different because, as you remember, we didn't have a bubble overheated economy before the crisis, since the Hungarian economy experienced a slowdown already before the crisis. So it's a unique situation, but I'm not going to talk about the Hungarian story. When we have discussions, we'll have an ample opportunity to discuss it. What happened after the crisis, and the Polish-Romanian statistics would look like more or less the same. We had a current account deficit for years after years after years, quite sizable in terms of GDP, 7-8%, and it's too high. When I attended the university at that time called Karl Marx University, the rule of thumb was that current account deficit over 3-4% is dangerous. Now we had twice as high. Nobody really cared about it because being in the European Union, the hypothesis was that it's all right, it's no problem, it's just an internet story. Now the crisis hit the region and now we have a surplus. So the Hungarian external position, well, the short for current account, actually it's more or less the same. As you can see, we have a surplus. So some of the bad news that the economy has slowed down and we don't grow fast, but at least the external conditions improve. The income balance is negative. Profit and of foreign companies leaving the country, the interest rate we pay after the loan leaving the country. What has changed, two factors. The balance of goods and services, so let's call it the foreign trade balance, has improved tremendously. We have a net export driven by the automotive industry and other, most typically export production by foreign investors, and also transfer balance. the EU funds and the sizable EU funds which help us in keeping the external balance in the positive range and supporting the foreign's relative stability. And these EU funds amount to 2-3% of GDP net inflows, which we of course welcome. The particular Hungarian problem, and I just mentioned it for our visitors, but also for ourselves, because this is a calculation of the central bank, the Magyar Nemzeti Bank, and it's a very complicated mathematical mathematical calculation. What is the natural growth rate of an economy? So not the actual growth rate, because the actual growth rate can be manipulated by spending more, spending less in the budget surplus, budget deficit, but what is the natural growth rate? And as you can see, before the crisis we had a 2-3% of growth, and now it has come down to 1, and it's a worrying situation. The employment is a problem, the capital is a problem, and the productivity is a problem. So we have 3 sorts of problems, and it's not easy to solve. This natural growth rate is not it's a given for life. It's not a fate. It's just a situation. It can come down, can go up, but we don't actually know. Let's tell us frankly, we don't know how to push up the growth rate on the long term, because this is much more than an economic policy issue. It's a social, regional, cultural, and also as far as the capital is controlled, the country is creating, the attitude of foreign investors and domestic investors vis-a-vis the given economy. So it's a worrying statistics indicating that we have some short-term policy problems, but we also have underlying social problem, which is a particularly Hungarian problem. Now, just to finish up about the present, the most recent forecast of the IMF, which was published October a month ago, is as we heard last night that the advanced countries are improving, so the mood is a bit happier because there's a recovery in important rich economies, and there's some relative slowdown in the fast-growing BRICS countries. As far as the region is concerned, the complicated transition years seem to be over, and there's a slight recovery in the region. The 2-3% is the average that the IMF calculation forecast for the region. The Hungarian 1-2% growth should be seen in, compared to the regional average. Unfortunately, we are below these statistics. But there's improvement in the world. There's improvement in the Europes that are close to us. Not Southern Europe, which has still a problem. Italy, Spain experiencing some problem. Certainly, this very minimum growth, as pointed out by Normal Amount yesterday, is certainly not much to be proud of, but in some sense, oh yes, because compared to the previous years, any recovery is welcome. The conclusions in my opening address, and then we would continue going into detail and also policy issues and other components. It's extremely complicated story of financial crisis. These are personal for remarks of mine, because I cannot stop talking about the Eurozone. Probably I'm the only one who's pretty optimistic about the Euro. I noticed last night that the mood was less pro-Euro Now, if I look at the statistics, I see that euro is here. Euro is used in daily, actually, in business, and therefore it's an anchor. We have to understand with our foreign trade patterns, the euro is an anchor used in business, used overused in households. That was a problem, but on the whole, euro is a given. But we are not ready. So if we look at the most of the Maastricht criteria, we can fulfill some, we cannot fulfill others, and particularly the debt being 80% is way too high. And if the Eurozone takes the entry conditions seriously, we'll have to wait decades, so to say, before meeting the targets, unless the EU club is liberal in defining the conditions. Second, we have a problem with the government and bank relationship. My text is gone, but I touched upon a very sensitive story, the government and bank relationship. This is a bad equilibrium. The government blaming the banks for over lending, and then the banks complain about being overtaxed. And I think it's a bad equilibrium. We should have a better equilibrium. And finally, I don't know what was my final remark, but finally, the conditions improve for Central Eastern Europe and for Central Europe, statistically speaking, from the European Union perspective, because of the German recovery, and we depend very much on the German industry, a little bit on other parts of the world, not much influenced by the southern periphery. The southern periphery is important, of course, for the euro, and in consequence for the financial life, but economically speaking, the dynamism of the country is covered in my introductory presentation. What counts more is Central Europe, Western Europe, and North Europe. And in this respect, I'm pretty optimistic about the future, the coming 2 to 3 years, what can be seen with some certainty, look better than the 2-3 years behind us. Mr. Chairman, I would stop here, and then we could start discussing the events and story.